Good evening. Before we start, I'd like to welcome the Rutgers Club of Washington. We're both Rutgers alum and happy to see you. Also like to acknowledge the great help we got from Jan Herman, historian and archivist at BUMED, who's sitting here. And finally, Jared and Kate Michael, who are sort of in the back there, and they are cousins of Ben Steele. So with that, we'll get started.
Thank you for coming tonight to talk about Tears in the Darkness. But before we get to the details of the Death March and the amazing stories of the men from that era, Filipinos, Americans, and Japanese, let's talk a little bit about the first days of World War II. At approximately 7:55 a.m., December 7, 1941, Hawaii time, Japanese bombers and fighters appeared over the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor and within an hour destroyed most of the Pacific Fleet there, killing 3,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines. Most of us, of course, have heard of that moment, but the attack on Pearl Harbor was only a series of attacks that began World War II in the Pacific. In the next 8 hours, the Japanese also struck other targets in the Pacific, among them America's most important possession in the area, the Philippine Islands. There, they bombed Clark Field and destroyed the American Air Force. 2 weeks later, on the morning of December 22nd, the Imperial Japanese 14th Army invaded the Philippine Islands. The Japanese landed 43,000 men. The Americans and Filipinos met them with roughly 110,000 men. The problem was, with the American Air Force destroyed, the inexperienced, ill-trained, and badly equipped American and Filipino troops had no airplanes to protect them and no Navy to resupply them. And it didn't take the Japanese very long to push the Filipinos and Americans back and back again to a final defensive position on the tiny peninsula of Bataan. There, for 99 days, the defenders were under siege. Finally, sick, starving, and outgunned, the Bataan force, 76,000 men, surrendered. It was the first major land battle for America in World War II, and as you've heard, it was the worst defeat in American military history. After the battle, the Japanese wanted to get their prisoners off Bataan as quickly as possible so they could use the peninsula to stage for an invasion of tiny Corregidor, the island fortress in the middle of Manila Bay that not only guarded the bay, but also guarded the best deep-water port in the Pacific. So the Japanese lined up their 76,000 captives in columns, and they started marching them north up a road called the Old National Road under a blistering tropical sun. They didn't give them enough food, and they didn't give them enough water. And since the men were sick and starving from months of fighting, they started to drop. At first, the Japanese tried to beat the dropouts to their feet. Then, to keep the columns moving, they just killed them. They bludgeoned them, they bayoneted them, they decapitated them, they shot them, they ran them down like dogs in the road. The Death March was only the beginning of this story of war and atrocity. In the 3 years that followed, the marchers were penned up in one stinking hellhole after another. Some 60,000 Filipino soldiers were imprisoned for roughly 8 months, then released as civilians. More than a third of them, 26,000 men, died in prison camp. The Americans were held for 3 years. Many were shipped to Japan to work as slave laborers in mines, factories, and shipyards. Finally, in August 1945, the Americans were liberated. 25,000 Americans went into captivity at the beginning of World War II in the Pacific. 15,000 came home, and for those of you who can do quick math, that's a death rate of more than 40%. By comparison, in the European theater, Allied prisoners of war suffered a death rate of 3%.
It took a long time to find a way to tell this story, tell it so the reader could see war, feel war, experience war on the page. We did not want to write a history from on high. We wanted to tell it from ground level, from the point of view of the men who fought and were captured. We have not counted them up, but we are guessing there are probably 100 voices in Tears in the Darkness. To keep the story from going off in 100 directions, we come back every now and then in the book to one particular voice. We come back to one man who went through everything that we wrote about, a young Montana cowboy called Ben Steele. Ben Steele went through everything: the battle, the death march, the prison camps, the hell ships to Japan, then slave labor in a Japanese coal mine. Along the way, he taught himself to draw, and after the war became a professor of art. 22 of his remarkable sketches from those dark days as a POW are set right here to the text of the book, and you'll see many of these sketches tonight. We've made slides of them to show you. It also took a long time to dig out the story of the Japanese. We spent 3 weeks in Japan talking to 23 former Imperial Army soldiers, and a quarter of the book is told from their point of view. We think that that perspective makes our story unique. Now tonight, we're going to try to give you a small sample of those 3 narratives or storytelling points of view. We're going to talk about the heart of the book, the Death March, and begin with you experiencing the march through Ben Steele's point of view, Ben Steele's eyes.
Okay, we'd like you to sit back for a moment and imagine that you're on Bataan. It's April 9th or 10th, 1942. You've just been told that your commanding general has surrendered you to the Japanese, and the rumors are that the Japanese don't take prisoners. You don't really believe this because you don't want to believe it, but you are afraid nonetheless. You're sitting somewhere, maybe in the middle of a jungle, maybe by the side of some road, just waiting for the enemy to come along and take you into custody or kill you. You're exhausted because for days the enemy has been chasing you and you've been running away from them, running for your life. Your nerves are shot. The enemy has been bombing and shelling you for months, and the fear is now a permanent part of you. You're hungry. You are very hungry, more hungry than you ever could have imagined. For months during the battle, you've been living on nothing but rice, mush, and tuna flakes and monkey meat. You are malnourished, and the lack of vitamins has made your muscles weak, your mind muddled, your courage falter. It's hot, hotter than you have ever known. 110 degrees, 120 degrees. You're on a road marching north off Bataan, walking in one long column of men after another, 4 abreast. You don't know where you're going. It's hard, this walking, very hard on everything, especially your feet.
We're going to read some very brief excerpts from the book on the Death March, and this is the first one from the book. Ben Steele was watching for socks. Men were starting to blister, big blisters the size of a $50, blisters in clusters, breaking and bleeding with every step. Some men used sharp rocks to make slits in their shoes and boots, makeshift sandals, but their feet were so swollen the skin just bulged painfully through the openings. Others removed their footwear and walked barefoot, wincing with every step. He had to find dry socks, or soon he too would be hobbled. Ben Steele pawed through the packs and bags abandoned along the road. Finally, somewhere north of Cab Cabin, he saw what he'd been looking for. A corpse on the shoulder of the road was just ahead. The dead man was wearing garrison shoes, low quarters instead of work boots, and the laces were untied and loose. Ben Steele removed one of those shoes, stripped off the sock, and was reaching for the other foot when out of the corner of his eye he spotted a guard headed his way and dashed back to his place in the column. "What the hell were you doing back there with that dead guy?" said one of his fellow marchers. "You gotta take care of your feet," Ben Steele said, "or you're not going to get very far."
Most of all, you're thirsty. Thirsty from the glaring sun and oven-like heat and the thick dust from the road that hangs like a cloud over you, filling your mouth, your eyes, your nose. Water. You have got to have some water. But the damn guards won't let you stop as the columns pass by small rivers and springs and pipes from artesian wells. They're shooting men who stop. They're stabbing men who stop.
From the book. Ben Steele was drying up. His tongue was swollen. He felt himself gagging on it. He looked at the sun. Not a prairie sun, he thought. This one was hotter, less forgiving. No trees, no building, no shade. He stripped off his T-shirt and draped it over his head. Somewhere north of Cab Cabin, he got his first sun treatment in an assembly area. Must have been more than 2,000 men sitting in that damn field. Why the hell were the Japs doing that? Didn't make any sense. Mean bunch of bastards. Back on the road, he was choking again. Man next to him had some water. "Hey, give me a drink, will ya?" Ben Steele said. The man kept walking. "Come on, buddy, I'm in bad shape. What do you say?" "Here," said the man, relenting. Don't take it all, you understand?" Farther on, walking in the first rank at the head of a column, Ben Steele caught a glimpse of something at the side of the road. A half-gallon tin can, and it was half filled with water. An offering from one of the locals, he guessed. Now he was the one with the drink, and other men began to pull at his sleeve and implore him, "Water, come on, water." When the can was empty, he would dip it in a rice paddy, a wallow, a drainage ditch.